Story 1, The Honeymoon Vanishing. Part 1, The Beginning. It was a warm evening in July 2019 on the beautiful Caribbean island of St. Lucia. The waves rolled softly onto the shore, and the golden sunset reflected across the calm ocean water. Inside a luxury resort overlooking the beach, friends and family gathered to celebrate what was supposed to be a perfect beginning. Just hours earlier, Melissa Turner and Daniel Whitmore had said their vows. The ceremony had been small but elegant. White flowers lined the aisle, candles flickered in the warm evening breeze, and the sound of gentle music drifted through the air. Melissa looked radiant in her flowing white dress. Daniel stood beside her, smiling confidently as the two promised to spend the rest of their lives together. To everyone watching, they seemed like the perfect couple. After the celebration ended, guests slowly returned to their rooms, while the newlyweds stayed behind to enjoy their first night as husband and wife. But sometime after midnight, something strange happened. The next morning, resort staff noticed something unusual. The couple never came down for breakfast. At first, no one thought much of it. After all, newlyweds often sleep late after a long wedding night. But by midday, concern began to grow. When hotel staff knocked on the door of the honeymoon suite, there was no answer. Eventually, security opened the room. Inside, everything looked almost normal. Melissa's phone was resting on the bedside table. Daniel's wallet sat neatly beside it. Their luggage was still unpacked near the bed. And most strangely of all, their wedding rings were left behind. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken furniture, no overturned objects, just an empty room, and two people who had completely vanished. Later that afternoon, police began searching the surrounding resort grounds and nearby beaches. Guests were questioned. Staff members were interviewed, but nobody could explain where the newly married couple had gone. Then investigators made a discovery that would change the entire direction of the case. Security cameras from the resort captured the last known footage of the couple. In the video, Melissa could be seen walking alone toward a narrow beach trail leading into a wooded area near the cliffs. About 10 minutes later, Daniel followed the same path. Neither of them were ever seen returning. And from that moment forward, the honeymoon that was supposed to mark the beginning of a happy life together became the start of a disturbing mystery. A mystery that would soon reveal betrayal, manipulation, and a truth far darker than anyone could have imagined. Story 1, The Honeymoon Vanishing. Part 2, The Investigation. By the evening of the second day, the quiet luxury resort in St. Lucia had transformed into an active crime scene. Police officers moved carefully through the sandy paths and tropical gardens, questioning staff members and guests who had attended the wedding of Melissa Turner and Daniel Whitmore. At first, investigators believed the couple may have simply gone swimming late at night. But the ocean search teams quickly ruled that out. There were no signs of drowning, no personal items near the water, and no witnesses who had seen the couple on the beach that night. Then detectives reviewed the resort's security footage more carefully. The cameras showed something strange. Just after midnight, Melissa appeared on camera walking alone along a narrow pathway that led toward a secluded beach trail near the cliffs. She moved slowly, almost as if she were thinking about something. 10 minutes later, Daniel appeared in the same area. He walked down the exact same trail. But unlike Melissa, Daniel looked tense. His head turned several times, as if he was checking to see if anyone was watching. After that moment, neither of them appeared on any other cameras. The trail where they had disappeared quickly became the center of the investigation. Search teams combed through the thick vegetation along the cliffside path. Hours passed. Then one of the officers made a discovery. Partially hidden between rocks near the edge of a bluff was a small piece of torn white fabric. The fabric looked disturbingly familiar. It appeared to be from a wedding dress. Not far from it, investigators found something even more troubling. A small silver bracelet. The bracelet had dried blood stains on it. Later that night, the item was confirmed to belong to Melissa Turner. Suddenly, the case was no longer just a disappearance. It was now being treated as a possible violent crime. Detectives began shifting their focus toward the people who had been closest to the couple during the wedding. Friends, family members, and especially the bridal party. Among them was Melissa's maid of honor, Hannah Clark. At first, Hannah appeared cooperative and calm. She told investigators that the wedding had been beautiful and that nothing unusual had happened during the celebration. But when detectives examined phone records belonging to Daniel Whitmore, something unexpected appeared. Hidden within dozens of messages was a private conversation between Daniel and Hannah. The messages were personal, far more personal than they should have been. And as detectives read further, a disturbing possibility began to take shape. It seemed that the groom and the maid of honor had been secretly involved with each other. And even more unsettling, there were signs that Melissa may have discovered the affair shortly before the wedding. If that was true, then the perfect wedding in paradise might have been hiding a dangerous secret, one that could explain why the honeymoon ended in disappearance, and why someone may have wanted Melissa Turner gone forever. Story 1, The Honeymoon Vanishing. Part 3, The Betrayal. As investigators continued digging into the lives of Melissa Turner and Daniel Whitmore, the story behind their perfect wedding slowly began to fall apart. From the outside, their relationship had seemed happy. Friends described them as charming, successful, and deeply in love. But behind the scenes, things were far more complicated. Detectives carefully analyzed Daniel's phone records from the days leading up to the wedding in St. Lucia. Buried among dozens of normal conversations were hundreds of messages exchanged between Daniel and Melissa's maid of honor, Hannah Clark. At first, the messages looked harmless. Friendly conversations, jokes, late-night chats. But as investigators scrolled deeper through the messages, the tone changed. The conversations became more personal, more intimate. Eventually, it became clear that Daniel and Hannah had been involved in a secret relationship for months. A relationship they had carefully hidden from everyone, especially Melissa. But one message stood out more than all the others. It had been sent just 2 days before the wedding. In the message, Hannah wrote, "Does she know?" Daniel replied only minutes later, "Not yet, but I'll handle it." Those 4 words immediately caught the attention of investigators, because according to several wedding guests, something strange had happened on the day of the ceremony. Multiple friends later told police that Melissa had seemed unusually quiet during the reception. At one point, a bridesmaid even saw her step outside alone, holding her phone and crying. No one knew exactly what she had seen, but detectives soon developed a troubling theory. Melissa may have discovered the affair just hours before marrying Daniel. And if she had confronted him about it later that night, the argument could have turned into something far worse. But just as investigators began building their case, the entire story suddenly took a shocking turn. Part 4, The Shocking Twist. Nearly 4 months after the disappearance, the case had grown cold. Search teams had found no bodies, no additional evidence, and no clear explanation for what had happened on that beach trail. Many people had already assumed the worst. that the ocean had taken both of them. But then, an unexpected phone call came into the police station. A woman from the state of Georgia reported something strange. She claimed that while shopping at a small grocery store, she had seen a woman who looked exactly like Melissa Turner. The woman had seemed nervous, quiet, almost as if she was trying not to be noticed. When the witness later saw Melissa's face on a missing persons report online, she immediately contacted authorities. At first, detectives were skeptical, but when investigators reviewed security footage from the store, their doubts quickly disappeared. The woman in the video looked almost identical to Melissa. The same hair, the same face, the same posture. If the footage was real, then one impossible question suddenly appeared. How could Melissa be alive? If investigators believed she had died on a cliffside trail months earlier, the sighting reopened the entire investigation, and detectives soon began uncovering a much darker truth. A truth suggesting that Daniel Whitmore might not have been a grieving husband at all, but something far more dangerous. Someone who had been manipulating everyone around him for a very long time. Story 1, The Honeymoon Vanishing. Part 5, The Dark Truth. After the reported sighting in Georgia, investigators reopened the mysterious disappearance of Melissa Turner. For months, the case had been treated as a tragic accident. But now, detectives began to suspect something far more disturbing. If Melissa was alive, then what had really happened on that cliffside trail in St. Lucia? Authorities quietly began tracing financial records, phone activity, and travel logs connected to the missing bride. Eventually, they discovered something unexpected. Someone had been using a prepaid phone registered under a false name. The phone had been activated just days after the disappearance, and its signal had repeatedly appeared in small towns across the southeastern United States. Investigators followed the trail carefully. Then one evening, they finally located the person using the phone. When police approached the small apartment where the signal was coming from, they prepared themselves for the worst. But what they found inside shocked everyone. Sitting quietly in the dim light of the room was Melissa Turner. Alive, but she looked very different from the woman in the wedding photos. She appeared exhausted, thin, and deeply afraid. At first, Melissa refused to speak, but after several hours of questioning, she finally began to explain what had really happened that night. According to Melissa, she had confronted her husband, Daniel Whitmore, after discovering messages between him and Hannah Clark. The confrontation took place along the same isolated beach trail seen in the resort's security footage. What started as an argument quickly turned dangerous. Melissa told investigators that Daniel became furious when she threatened to expose the affair. Then, in a moment of rage, he pushed her toward the edge of the rocky cliff. Melissa fell several feet down the steep slope below. She survived the fall, but she was injured and terrified. From the shadows below the cliff, she watched as Daniel searched the area above. At one point, she heard him calling her name, but the tone of his voice wasn't worried. It sounded angry. And that was the moment Melissa realized something horrifying. Her husband hadn't been trying to save her. He had been trying to make sure she was dead. Terrified that he would come back to finish what he started, Melissa waited until the area was quiet before slowly escaping the cliffs. Instead of going to the police, she made a desperate decision. She disappeared. For months, she moved from place to place, staying under false names and avoiding contact with anyone from her past. She believed that Daniel was capable of finding her and finishing the job. But the deeper investigators looked into Daniel Whitmore, the darker the story became. During the renewed investigation, Detectives uncovered evidence linking Daniel to another suspicious death several years earlier. A former girlfriend had died under mysterious circumstances. At the time, the case had been ruled an accident, but the new evidence suggested otherwise. With Melissa's testimony and the new findings, authorities finally had enough to act. Within weeks, police arrested Daniel Whitmore. He was charged with attempted murder in Melissa's case and later connected to the earlier homicide as well. For the outside world, the story had once looked like a tragic honeymoon disappearance. But the truth was far darker. Behind the perfect wedding photos and the romantic island getaway was a man who had been hiding something dangerous all along. And for Melissa Turner, the honeymoon that should have been the beginning of a happy life had almost become the end of it. But that was only the first story tonight. The next case begins on a quiet train where something deeply disturbing happened in the middle of the night. Story 2, The Night Train Murder. Part 1, The Beginning. On a quiet autumn night in October 2016, a long-distance train slowly traveled through the countryside of Germany. Most passengers were asleep. The rhythmic sound of the train wheels echoed softly through the dark cabins as the train moved toward its final destination in Berlin. Among the passengers that night was a 27-year-old graduate student named Alina Fisher. Alina had spent the weekend visiting friends in the southern part of the country and was now returning home. She had booked a small private sleeper cabin near the middle of the train. Friends later described Alina as intelligent, calm, and responsible. She was studying criminal psychology and hoped to one day work with law enforcement. Before boarding the train, Alina sent a short message to her sister. "The train just left. I'll be home in the morning." It would be the last message she ever sent. Hours passed quietly as the train moved through the darkness. Around 2:30 in the morning, one of the conductors walking through the sleeper cabins noticed something unusual. The door to Alina's cabin was slightly open. Normally, passengers kept their doors locked while sleeping. At first, the conductor assumed she may have stepped out to the restroom. But something didn't feel right. The lights inside the cabin were still on. When he gently pushed the door open, he immediately froze. Inside the small cabin, Alina was lying motionless on the lower bunk. Her bag was open on the floor, and the narrow corridor outside the cabin was completely empty. The train staff quickly contacted authorities. By the time the train reached Berlin a few hours later, police officers were already waiting at the station. What they discovered inside that quiet sleeper cabin would soon become one of the most disturbing train crimes in recent history, because investigators quickly realized something chilling. The person responsible for Alina's death was almost certainly still on the train that night, and somewhere among the sleeping passengers, a killer had been traveling quietly through the darkness. Story 2, The Night Train Murder. Part 2, The Investigation. By the time the train rolled into Berlin, the city was quiet, but inside the police station, chaos had quietly erupted. The authorities had been notified that a young woman, Alina Fisher, had disappeared from her sleeper cabin during the overnight journey. Officers immediately began reviewing the train's surveillance footage. The images from the corridor cameras were grainy, but chillingly clear. At around 2:30 a.m., the last time Alina was seen on camera, she was walking toward the small restroom at the end of her car. She looked normal, calm, almost unaware of the danger that would soon find her. But the next camera showed nothing. No movement. No figure of Alina returning to her cabin. Only the quiet flicker of the corridor lights. Investigators quickly realized that something more sinister than a simple disappearance was at play. They examined the train car carefully, cabin by cabin. The lock to Alina's cabin was not broken. Her personal belongings, wallet, phone, and a small backpack, were neatly placed on the lower bunk. Nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed. Yet the passenger was gone. Detectives then questioned the passengers who had shared the car or the adjacent cabins. No one had seen anyone enter or leave Alina's cabin that night. Some mentioned hearing faint footsteps in the corridor around the time of her disappearance. But by the time anyone investigated, the noise had vanished, leaving only an eerie silence. The authorities soon broadened the investigation beyond the train. They contacted her friends and family to reconstruct her movements before boarding. Alina's last known message, sent to her sister at 10:45 p.m., seemed ordinary. "The train just left. I'll be home in the morning." No hint of fear. No warning. Then a breakthrough came from an unlikely source, the conductor's report. He remembered noticing a passenger acting strangely in the same car. A man quietly observing the cabin doors, glancing back and forth, appearing almost too interested in the occupants of the sleeper cabins. His movements were subtle, easily missed by most, but the conductor's careful memory was crucial. Police identified him as Stefan Mueller, a man traveling alone. His ticket information seemed legitimate, and his identification appeared valid. Yet something about his presence on the train that night didn't fit. He had no luggage, no destination beyond the city, and a strange, unsettling calm. Forensic investigators scoured the train for any physical evidence. They discovered a faint smudge of blood near Alina's cabin threshold. It wasn't enough to immediately identify her or the perpetrator, but it confirmed the officers' growing fear. Alina hadn't left the train voluntarily. Every clue led them deeper into a mystery that seemed impossible. How could someone vanish from a locked sleeper cabin in the middle of the night without a trace? And if she hadn't left voluntarily, who had the opportunity, the knowledge, and the motive to make her disappear silently on that quiet train? Story 2, The Night Train Murder. Part 3, The Horrifying Discovery. Hours turned into a tense morning in Berlin, yet Alina Fisher was still missing. Police began retracing every possible step on the train, questioning passengers one by one. Many remembered hearing nothing unusual, only the gentle hum of the wheels on the rails. But a few recalled a shadowy figure, a man, lingering near Alina's cabin around 2:30 a.m. Officers now focused on Stefan Mueller, the passenger who had seemed too calm, almost as if he had been waiting. His cabin was empty. No luggage. No belongings. But when detectives examined it carefully, they discovered something chilling. A small, blood-stained knife hidden beneath the mattress. The knife had fingerprints that didn't match anyone in the passenger manifests, except Stefan. He had vanished from the train before it even reached Berlin. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of the corridor outside Alina's cabin revealed faint traces of her blood. The smudges told a terrifying story. She had been attacked inside her own cabin and dragged into the shadows of the train's hidden maintenance corridors, places passengers rarely ever saw. The more the investigators uncovered, the stranger it became. Surveillance from other cars showed the same shadowy figure slipping quietly through the corridors, almost ghost-like, avoiding any camera that might capture him. Hours later, detectives found something even more unsettling. A notebook in the train's lost and found had been left behind. Inside, it contained detailed notes, diagrams of the sleeper cabins, careful observations of passengers' habits, and chillingly, a list of names. Alina Fisher was at the top, and beside her name a single word, next. Suddenly, the case was no longer just a disappearance. It was the work of a calculated predator, someone who had planned every step, every movement, every detail. And the thought that he had been moving silently, unnoticed, through the train while passengers slept. It made every heartbeat of that quiet night feel more dangerous. By evening, the police had assembled a team to track down Stefan Mueller. But with each lead, he seemed to slip further away, always just out of reach. And yet, the investigators knew one terrifying truth. If Alina had survived the night, it was only by luck. Because the predator on the night train was still out there, and he had one rule: never leave witnesses alive. Story 2, The Night Train Murder. Part 4, The Final Revelation and Arrest. Days passed, but Stefan Mueller remained elusive. Police scoured Berlin, following every lead, every trace, every small clue left behind on the train. Then one evening, a breakthrough arrived. A local shop owner in a quiet suburb recognized a man matching Stefan's description. He had been buying food and supplies, always careful, always alone. Authorities moved quickly, surrounding the small apartment. Inside, the scene was eerily quiet. The man they had been hunting for days was there. Stefan Mueller did not resist. His calm demeanor never faltered. When police searched the apartment, they found evidence that confirmed their worst fears. Alina's backpack and a few personal items. A notebook with detailed plans of the train and its passengers. Maps marking each sleeper cabin, along with handwritten notes describing behaviors and vulnerabilities. Alina herself was found hidden in a cramped, dark corner of the apartment. She had survived by remaining silent, completely still, waiting for the predator to leave the room. Exhausted, terrified, and injured, but alive. As she recounted the night's events to investigators, the full horror became clear. Stefan had been planning this crime for weeks. He had carefully observed Alina, tracking her habits and movements. When the train moved through the countryside in the early hours, he struck, dragging her into the maintenance corridor. He had intended to make her disappear forever. But Alina had escaped, and her survival had led to Stefan's capture. Within hours, he was charged with attempted murder of Alina Fisher, kidnapping, multiple prior disappearances linked through similar patterns. The case shocked Germany and the world. It was a chilling reminder. Even in the quiet hum of a night train, danger can move silently, almost invisible. Passengers may sleep, but someone may be watching, waiting, planning. And for Alina, the terrifying night could have ended in death. Instead, her bravery and luck ensured that justice would finally catch the predator who haunted the rails. Story 3, The Vanished Child. Part 1, The Disappearance. In the quiet Bavarian town of Wurzburg, late November evenings often arrived with a soft blanket of fog. Streetlights glowed faintly through the mist. The narrow streets were peaceful, and the small houses sat quietly beside one another like they had for generations. It was the kind of town where neighbors knew each other's names, where children still played outside in the fatting light, and where nothing truly frightening was supposed to happen. On one such evening, 8-year-old Lena Bauer was playing in the backyard of her family home. The Bauer house stood near the edge of a quiet residential street. Behind it was a small yard surrounded by a wooden fence and a few old trees that creaked gently in the cold wind. Lena loved this little space. Even in the chilly November air, she bundled herself in a thick red scarf and spent time outside with her small brown dog, Max. Max chased a rubber ball across the damp grass while Lena laughed softly, her breath forming little clouds in the cold evening air. Inside the house, Lena's mother was preparing dinner. Through the kitchen window, she occasionally glanced outside, smiling as she watched her daughter play. Everything about the evening felt ordinary, peaceful, safe. But as the fog slowly thickened across the street, something began to change. The quiet backyard grew strangely still. Max stopped chasing the ball. The small dog suddenly froze near the fence, his ears raised sharply, as if he had heard something unusual. Lena noticed the change immediately. "Max," she called softly. The dog didn't move. Instead, he stared toward the far corner of the yard, where the shadows gathered beneath an old tree. For a moment, Lena felt a strange unease. The fog had grown thicker there, curling around the fence like pale smoke. She took a few cautious steps toward the corner of the yard. The grass beneath her shoes made a faint crunch. "Hello," she said quietly, unsure why she felt the need to speak. No one answered, but something about the silence felt wrong. Max suddenly whimpered. Then, without warning, the backyard lights flickered once, just for a second. And in that single moment of darkness, something happened. Across the kitchen window, Lena's mother looked up again, expecting to see her daughter in the yard. But Lena was gone. The rubber ball lay in the wet grass. Max stood alone near the fence, barking nervously into the fog. At first, Lena's mother assumed her daughter had simply run to the side of the house. But after stepping outside and calling her name several times, a growing sense of dread began to settle in. "Lena," she called louder. The fog swallowed her voice. Max ran in small, anxious circles, whining softly. The red scarf Lena had been wearing lay crumpled near the fence. And that was the moment when the ordinary November evening shattered completely. Within minutes, neighbors began gathering outside the Bauer home. Porch lights turned on across the street. People searched the yard, the sidewalk, and the nearby park. But there was no sign of Lena. Not a footprint. Not a cry for help. Nothing. Soon, police cars arrived, their flashing lights glowing through the thick fog of Lewisburg. Officers began searching the surrounding streets, while neighbors whispered among themselves. Some believed the child had wandered away. Others feared something much worse. But one terrifying question hung silently in the cold night air. How could a child disappear from her own backyard, without anyone seeing or hearing a single thing? And as the fog slowly crept through the quiet streets of the town, the search for Lena Bauer had only just begun. Story 3, The Vanished Child. Part 2, The Search Begins. The night Lena disappeared, the quiet streets of Lewisburg were suddenly filled with flashing blue lights. Police cars lined the narrow road outside the Bauer home. Officers moved quickly through the yard, shining flashlights across the damp grass and along the wooden fence. Search teams were organized within minutes. Neighbors joined the effort, walking slowly through the nearby park, calling Lena's name into the fog. But the fog only seemed to swallow their voices. Inside the Bauer house, Lena's parents sat with detectives, trying desperately to answer every question. Had Lena ever run away before? Did she know any strangers in the neighborhood? Had anyone suspicious been seen near the house recently? The answers were always the same. No. Lena was a quiet, cheerful child. She had never wandered far from home, and nothing unusual had ever happened in their peaceful neighborhood. Outside, investigators carefully examined the backyard. Flashlights illuminated the damp ground. The rubber ball still lay where it had been dropped. Max, Lena's small dog, refused to leave the corner of the yard where he had first started barking. He kept packing back and forth near the fence, whining softly. An officer noticed something unusual there. The wooden fence had a narrow gate that opened to a small path leading behind several houses. It was rarely used, but tonight the latch hung slightly open. Nearby, investigators found the red scarf Lena had been wearing. It was caught on a rough piece of wood near the gate. One detective carefully lifted the scarf and placed it in an evidence bag. A chilling thought began forming among the officers. If Lena had left the yard through that gate, she had not done it alone. Search teams followed the narrow path behind the houses. The fog was even thicker there, drifting between trees and garden sheds. Flashlights moved slowly across the ground. Then, about 30 meters from the Bauer house, one of the officers stopped. In the soft dirt beside the path were faint impressions. Footprints, small ones, and beside them, larger ones. The tracks suggested that Lena had walked only a short distance before something else happened. The smaller footprints suddenly disappeared, but the larger ones continued deeper into the darkness. It was as if someone had lifted the child off the ground. The realization sent a quiet wave of dread through the search team. This was no simple disappearance. Someone had taken her. Back near the house, detectives began questioning the neighbors more carefully. One woman mentioned seeing a white van driving slowly down the street earlier that evening. Another neighbor remembered hearing a dog barking shortly before the police arrived. But no one had actually seen Lena leave the yard. No one had seen a stranger, and that made the mystery even more unsettling. The entire neighborhood had been calm, peaceful, ordinary. Yet somehow, in the span of a few seconds, a child had vanished. As midnight approached, the search continued. Police dogs were brought in. Their handlers allowed them to sniff Lena's scarf before leading them down the narrow path behind the houses. The dogs quickly picked up a scent. They followed it for several minutes through the fog-covered streets. But suddenly, the trail stopped, right beside the edge of a quiet road. Investigators looked around carefully. The pavement revealed no footprints, but one detail stood out clearly in the dim streetlight. Faint tire marks, fresh ones, the kind left by a vehicle that had stopped briefly and then driven away. Standing there in the cold November night, the officers slowly began to understand the frightening reality. Whoever had taken Lena Bauer had planned this carefully, and they were already gone. Story 3, The Vanished Child. Part 3, A Town in Fear. By the next morning, the disappearance of Lena Bauer had spread across the quiet town of Wurzburg. What had begun as a desperate search during the night was now something far more serious. Police officers remained outside the Bauer home, speaking with investigators and coordinating search teams. News of the missing child moved quickly through the neighborhood. Parents who had once allowed their children to play freely outside now kept them indoors. Curtains remained closed. Front doors were locked. And everywhere people gathered, the same uneasy question was whispered again and again. Who could have taken Lena? Throughout the morning, volunteers joined the search. Dozens of residents walked slowly through nearby forests and parks, calling her name into the cold November air. Police officers searched abandoned buildings, empty lots, and riverbanks. Helicopters even circled above the outskirts of the town, scanning the landscape below. But no trace of Lena appeared. Back at the police station, detectives studied every detail of the case. The tire marks discovered near the quiet road had been photographed and measured. Investigators confirmed that they likely belonged to a medium-sized van. The same type of vehicle several neighbors believed they had seen earlier that evening. But without a license plate number or clear description, the lead was frustratingly vague. Then another troubling detail emerged. One of the detectives reviewed reports of unusual activity in nearby towns over the past year. At first, the incident seemed unrelated, but a pattern slowly began to appear. In two neighboring towns not far from Wurzburg, There had been reports of strangers approaching children near parks and schoolyards. In both cases, the witnesses described a white van, the same vague detail, now connected to Lena's disappearance. The possibility that the same person might be involved sent a wave of concern through the investigation. If Lena had been taken by someone targeting children, there was no telling how far they might travel. Later that afternoon, detectives returned to the Bower neighborhood once again. They carefully examined the narrow path behind the houses where Lena's footprints had ended. Something about the area still felt incomplete. One investigator slowly walked farther along the path than the search teams had gone the night before. About 20 meters deeper into the trees, he noticed something unusual near a patch of wet leaves. A small object lay, partially hidden beneath a branch. At first glance, it looked insignificant, but when he bent down to examine it more closely, his expression immediately changed. It was a small plastic charm from a bracelet, bright blue, shaped like a tiny star. Moments later, Lena's mother confirmed something chilling. The charm had belonged to Lena. It had broken from her bracelet weeks earlier. She had been upset about losing it, and now it had been found far beyond the place where her footprints had disappeared. The discovery raised an unsettling possibility. Lena might have still been conscious when she was taken. Perhaps she had dropped the charm intentionally. A silent clue, a desperate attempt to leave a trail behind. For investigators, the discovery was both hopeful and terrifying. Hopeful because it meant Lena might still be alive. Terrifying because it proved she had been taken deeper into the darkness before being placed in the vehicle. As the sun began to set once again over the quiet streets of Lewisburg, the town felt different than it had the day before. The peaceful silence had been replaced with tension and fear. And somewhere, beyond the reach of the search teams, someone was hiding a missing child. Story 3, The Vanished Child. Part 4, The Hidden Truth. 2 days had now passed since Lena Bower vanished from her backyard in the quiet town of Lewisburg. The town felt different now. Streets that once seemed peaceful carried a heavy silence. Parents walked their children to school personally. Playgrounds stood empty, and everywhere people spoke in hushed voices about the same frightening mystery. Meanwhile, investigators continued working tirelessly. Detectives had begun reviewing security cameras from nearby roads and gas stations. Hours of footage were carefully examined. Most of it showed nothing unusual. Cars passing by, late-night delivery trucks, ordinary traffic. But then finally, something caught their attention. A security camera at a small gas station on the outskirts of town had captured a white van driving past just before midnight on the night Lena disappeared. The image was grainy, but one detail was clear. Part of the license plate was visible. Using that small piece of information, police began narrowing down possible matches. After several hours of searching through vehicle records, one name appeared. A man who lived only 20 kilometers outside the town. His name was Thomas Keller. At first glance, Thomas Keller appeared ordinary. He was in his mid-40s and lived alone in a small house near a wooded area outside the city. But as detectives looked deeper into his history, disturbing details began to surface. Years earlier, Keller had been questioned in connection with a complaint involving suspicious behavior near a playground. There had never been enough evidence to charge him with anything. But the record remained. The discovery was enough for investigators to act quickly. That evening, several police vehicles quietly drove toward Keller's isolated home. The house stood at the edge of a forest, far from other buildings. Its windows were dark. The surrounding area was silent. Officers approached carefully, surrounding the property before knocking on the door. There was no response. After several tense moments, the police forced their way inside. The house was eerily quiet. Rooms were dimly lit. And at first, there was no sign of anyone. But then one officer noticed something unusual. In the hallway, behind a large wooden cabinet, a small door had been partially hidden. It led down into a narrow basement. Flashlights illuminated the dark staircase as officers slowly descended. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a locked metal door. For a moment, everything was silent. Then they heard something. A faint sound. A soft movement from the other side. The door was forced open. Inside the small room, curled in the corner beneath a blanket, was a frightened child. It was Lena, weak and exhausted but alive. The officers immediately wrapped her in warm blankets and carried her upstairs. Outside, the cold night air felt strangely quiet as the rescue team brought Lena safely into an ambulance. But one question still remained. Where was Thomas Keller? Police searched the property thoroughly, but the suspect was gone. He had disappeared sometime earlier that evening. Despite this, the rescue of Lena Bauer brought enormous relief to the community. Within hours, news spread across Wurzburg that the missing child had been found alive. Yet the story was not completely over. Thomas Keller remained missing, and somewhere beyond the quiet forest surrounding the town, the man responsible for Lena's terrifying disappearance was still out there. Story 4: The Silent Suburban Disappearance. Part 1: The Quiet Street. On the peaceful outskirts of Heidelberg, there was a quiet suburban street where life moved slowly. The houses were neat and identical, with small gardens and white fences. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks in the afternoons. Neighbors greeted each other politely when collecting their mail. Nothing about the street suggested danger. Nothing about it hinted at the mystery that would soon unfold. Among the families living there was the Richter family. 9-year-old Jonas Richter lived in a small blue house with his parents and younger sister. Jonas was known throughout the neighborhood as a friendly, energetic child. He loved playing soccer with friends after school and often spent time riding his bicycle along the quiet street. For Jonas, the neighborhood felt safe. Everyone knew everyone. Nothing ever seemed to happen there. But on a cool autumn evening, that sense of safety quietly began to disappear. It was just after sunset. The sky above Heidelberg had turned a deep shade of blue, and the streetlights had begun to glow softly along the road. Jonas had been outside playing in the front yard. His soccer ball rolled across the pavement as he practiced kicking it toward a small goal he had made from 2 plastic bins. Inside the house, his mother was preparing dinner while occasionally glancing through the window. She could see Jonas clearly beneath the streetlight. Everything appeared completely normal. Across the street, a neighbor was watering plants. A car passed slowly down the road, and the quiet suburban evening continued peacefully. Then the soccer ball rolled too far. It crossed the sidewalk and stopped near the end of the street, close to a narrow pathway that led between 2 houses. Jonas jogged toward it. He picked up the ball and looked briefly down the dark pathway. The path led toward a small wooded area behind the neighborhood. During the day, children sometimes used it as a shortcut to the nearby park. But at night, it felt darker, quieter. For a moment, Jonas hesitated. Then he turned back toward his house. But as he stepped onto the sidewalk again, something unusual happened. A car slowed down beside the curb. The vehicle was dark-colored. Its windows were tinted, and the engine continued running quietly. Jonas paused. The passenger door opened slightly. From inside the car, a voice spoke softly. "Hey, can you help me for a moment?" The request sounded calm, ordinary, but something about it felt strange. Jonas took a cautious step backward. Inside the house, his mother glanced through the window again. The soccer ball lay on the sidewalk, but Jonas was no longer standing there. At first, she assumed he had stepped behind the car, or perhaps walked toward the path again. But after several seconds passed, a quiet feeling of unease began to settle in. She walked outside and looked down the street. The car was gone. The pathway between the houses stood empty, and Jonas had vanished without a sound. The soccer ball rolled slowly across the pavement before coming to a stop beneath the soft glow of the streetlight. Within minutes, the quiet suburban street outside the Richter home filled with concerned neighbors. People searched the yards and sidewalks. They called Jonas's name into the cool night air, but there was no answer. Soon, police cars arrived, their flashing lights reflecting off the silent houses of Heidelberg. And as investigators began asking questions, a chilling realization slowly began to spread through the neighborhood. A child had disappeared from one of the safest streets in the city. Story 4, The Silent Suburban Disappearance. Part 2, The First Clues. The quiet street in Heidelberg did not sleep that night. Long after darkness had settled over the neighborhood, flashing blue police lights continued to illuminate the houses along the road where Jonas Richter had vanished. Officers moved carefully from yard to yard, searching every corner of the neighborhood. Flashlights swept across fences, gardens, and sidewalks. Neighbors gathered in small groups along the street, speaking quietly while watching the search unfold. Many of them had known Jonas since he was a toddler. The idea that he could disappear so suddenly on such a peaceful street felt impossible. But the evidence was already beginning to suggest something far more disturbing than a simple accident. Investigators quickly began interviewing everyone who had been outside that evening. Jonas's mother described the last moment she had seen her son: the soccer ball rolling across the pavement, the dark-colored car slowing near the curb, and then nothing. Across the street, a neighbor recalled hearing the sound of a car engine idling for several minutes. Another resident reported seeing headlights turning slowly at the end of the road, shortly before Jonas disappeared. But no one had managed to see the license plate. No one had clearly seen the driver. The vehicle had simply appeared and then vanished into the night. Meanwhile, search teams began examining the narrow pathway between the houses where Jonas had briefly walked. The path led toward a small wooded area behind the neighborhood. Police dogs were brought in to track Jonas's scent. The dogs followed the trail along the pathway, their handlers moving slowly behind them. At first, the scent seemed strong. Jonas had clearly walked partway down the path. But then something unusual happened. About 20 meters into the wooded trail, the dogs suddenly stopped. They circled the same small area repeatedly, confused. The scent ended abruptly, as if Jonas had never continued beyond that point. One of the investigators crouched down and examined the ground carefully. The soil was slightly disturbed. Faint marks were visible near the edge of the path. Marks that suggested something heavy had briefly pressed into the dirt. Tire tracks. A vehicle had likely stopped there, which meant the dark car seen on the street may have moved through the back road behind the woods. If that was true, the person responsible had carefully planned the escape route. The discovery made the situation far more serious. Back on the street, detectives continued their interviews. During one conversation, an elderly resident mentioned something that caught the investigators' attention. Earlier that week, she had noticed a man sitting alone in a parked van near the end of the road. He had been there for several hours. At the time, she assumed he was waiting for someone who lived nearby. But now the memory felt unsettling. Police quickly began checking vehicle registrations in the surrounding area. They also reviewed security camera footage from nearby intersections. Hours of recordings were examined carefully. Most showed only ordinary evening traffic. But one camera captured something interesting. A white van driving slowly past a nearby intersection shortly after Jonas disappeared. The van's headlights briefly illuminated the road, and for a moment, the camera captured part of the vehicle's side, just enough to reveal a small company logo painted on the door. Investigators froze the image. The logo was partially visible, but recognizable. It belonged to a small local delivery company operating in the outskirts of Heidelberg. For the first time since the search began, detectives felt they might finally be getting closer to the person responsible. But one unsettling question still lingered in the minds of the investigators. If someone had been watching the neighborhood long enough to plan this, how long had they been observing Jonas Richter before the night he disappeared? Story 4, The Silent Suburban Disappearance. Part 3, The Man in the Van. The investigation into the disappearance of Jonas Richter moved quickly the following morning. Detectives in Heidelberg had spent most of the night studying the security camera footage that captured the white van leaving the neighborhood. The partial company logo painted on the side of the vehicle had given them their first real lead. The van belonged to a small regional delivery company that operated in several towns around the city. Investigators contacted the company early the next morning and requested a list of all drivers scheduled to work in the area. Within hours, they had narrowed the list down to only 3 employees who had been driving vans that night. 2 of the drivers had clear alibis. One had been making deliveries across town. Another had been working at a warehouse loading packages. But the third driver presented a problem. His name was Marcus Feldman. According to company records, Marcus had finished his delivery route earlier than expected that evening. After that point, his location was unclear. Phone records showed that his mobile device had been turned off for nearly 3 hours that night. 3 hours that investigators could not account for. Detectives quickly began gathering more information about Marcus Feldman. At first glance, his life appeared ordinary. He was 38 years old and lived alone in a small rented house on the edge of the city. His neighbors described him as quiet, polite, someone who mostly kept to himself. But as investigators looked deeper into his background, troubling details began to surface. Several years earlier, Marcus had been questioned after a complaint from parents at a local playground. Witnesses had reported seeing him watching children from inside his van. There had not been enough evidence to file charges, but the report remained in police records. Now, with Jonas missing and Marcus's van seen near the neighborhood, the old report suddenly seemed far more important. That afternoon, police officers drove toward Marcus Feldman's house. The small property stood near a wooded area on the outskirts of Heidelberg. When investigators arrived, they noticed something immediately. The white delivery van was parked in the driveway. Its engine was cold, and the house appeared quiet. Officers approached cautiously and knocked on the front door. There was no response. They knocked again. Still nothing. After confirming that no one inside answered the door, the officers obtained permission to enter the house. The interior felt strangely still. Curtains blocked most of the sunlight. Boxes and tools were scattered across the living room floor. It looked as though the house had been left in a hurry. But what investigators found next made the room fall completely silent. On a small table near the wall sat a child's soccer ball, blue and white. the same color as the one Jonas Richter had been playing with the night he disappeared. One officer carefully picked it up. The ball had a small black mark near one of the panels. Later, Jonas's mother would confirm the terrifying truth. It was his. Detectives immediately began searching the rest of the house. Drawers were opened. Closets were examined. The basement was checked. But there was no sign of Jonas. And there was no sign of Marcus Feldman either. The suspect had vanished. Standing in the quiet house, investigators slowly realized the disturbing reality. They had finally identified the man connected to the disappearance. But they were already too late to catch him there. And somewhere beyond the quiet streets of Heidelberg, both Jonas Richter and Marcus Feldman were missing. Story 4, The Silent Suburban Disappearance. Part 4, The Final Discovery. The search for Jonas Richter had now entered its third day. Across the quiet city of Heidelberg, the story had become the only thing people were talking about. Schools discussed safety measures. Parents kept their children close. And police officers continued working around the clock to track down the missing boy and the man now believed responsible, Marcus Feldman. Inside the police station, detectives carefully reviewed everything they had discovered inside Marcus's house. The most disturbing item had been the soccer ball belonging to Jonas. It confirmed what investigators had already feared. Jonas had been inside that house at some point after his disappearance, but the suspect had clearly moved him somewhere else. The question now was where. As investigators examined Marcus Feldman's financial and phone records, another clue slowly emerged. 2 days before the disappearance, Marcus had purchased several supplies from a hardware store outside the city. Among the items listed on the receipt were ropes, plastic containers, and a portable heater. The purchase seemed unusual for someone living alone. Even more interesting was the location of the store. It was near a rural area surrounded by farmland and abandoned buildings. Detectives decided to investigate the area immediately. Several police vehicles drove quietly along the narrow country roads just outside Heidelberg. The landscape there was very different from the peaceful suburban streets where Jonas had vanished. Open fields stretched across the horizon. Old barns and storage sheds stood scattered along dirt roads. The area felt isolated, quiet, the kind of place where someone could hide without being easily noticed. After nearly an hour of searching, officers spotted something unusual near an abandoned farm property. A white delivery van was parked beside a large wooden barn, the same van that belonged to Marcus Feldman. Police vehicles quickly surrounded the area. Officers approached carefully, weapons drawn, listening for any movement inside the building. The barn door stood slightly open. Inside, the air was cold and silent. Flashlights swept across the dark interior. Wooden beams creaked softly above. Then, from the far corner of the barn, a faint sound echoed through the darkness. A soft movement. An officer moved closer and shined his light toward a small storage room behind a stack of crates. The door was locked from the outside. When it was forced open, the officers found something that immediately changed the mood of the entire investigation. Sitting quietly on the floor, wrapped in an old blanket, was Jonas Richter. The boy looked frightened and weak, but he was alive. Paramedics were called immediately as officers carefully carried him outside into the cold evening air. Relief spread quickly through the team, but the operation was not finished yet. Officers continued searching the property for Marcus Feldman. Every room of the barn was checked. The surrounding fields were scanned with flashlights, but there was no sign of him. It appeared the suspect had escaped shortly before the police arrived. Later that night, The news spread quickly through the quiet neighborhoods of Heidelberg. Jonas Richter had been found alive. The community felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Yet the story still carried an unsettling ending. Because somewhere beyond the empty fields and dark country roads, the man responsible for the terrifying disappearance was still out there. And the search for Marcus Feldman had only just begun. Story 5, The Midnight Caller. Part 1, The First Call. In the quiet residential neighborhoods of Munich, most nights passed without anything unusual. The streets were calm. Apartment windows glowed softly with warm light, and the distant sound of passing trams echoed quietly through the city. For most residents, midnight meant rest. But for Anna Keller, midnight had slowly become the most unsettling hour of the night. Anna lived alone in a small third-floor apartment near the edge of the city. She worked long hours at a local bookstore and usually returned home late in the evening. Her life was simple, quiet, peaceful, and for many years, nothing had ever disturbed the routine she had built for herself. But everything began to change on a cold winter night. It was just after midnight when Anna heard the sound. Her phone was ringing. At first, she assumed it was a wrong number. Most of her friends knew she was asleep by that hour. Still half awake, she reached for the phone beside her bed. The screen displayed an unknown number. Anna hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello," she said softly. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then she heard something strange. A slow breathing sound. Someone was clearly on the other end of the call. But they were not speaking. Anna frowned slightly. "Hello, who is this?" The breathing continued. Then the call suddenly ended. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Anna looked at the phone again. The number was unfamiliar. For a moment, she considered calling back. But something about the strange breathing had left her feeling uneasy. She placed the phone back on the table and tried to return to sleep. The next morning, she almost forgot about the call completely. It had likely been a prank, or perhaps someone dialing the wrong number. But the following night, just after midnight, the phone rang again. The same unknown number appeared on the screen. This time, Anna hesitated longer before answering. Slowly, she pressed the green button. "Hello." Again, the same silence greeted her. Then the breathing returned. Low, slow, almost as if the person on the other end was standing very close to the phone. Anna felt a small chill run down her spine. "Stop calling me," she said firmly. But the caller still did not speak. The breathing continued for several seconds. Then the call disconnected once again. Now Anna felt something different. This no longer felt like a simple mistake. Someone had called her 2 nights in a row, at exactly the same time. Later that evening, she told a coworker about the strange calls. Her friend laughed and suggested it was probably a harmless prank. But Anna was not so sure. Something about the calls felt deliberate, as if the person on the other end wanted her to answer, wanted her to listen. And 2 nights later, the phone rang again. Midnight, the same unknown number. This time, Anna did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched the phone ring on the table beside her bed. After several seconds, the call stopped. The room became silent again. But just as she relaxed, a new notification appeared on her phone. A voicemail. Anna slowly pressed play. For a few seconds, the recording contained only silence. Then the same slow breathing filled the speaker. And finally, a whisper. A single sentence that made Anna freeze completely. "I can see you." Story 5, The Midnight Caller. Part 2, watching. The whisper from the voicemail stayed in Anna Keller's mind for the rest of the night. I can see you. At first, Anna thought it had to be a cruel joke. Maybe someone from work. Maybe a stranger who had somehow gotten her number. But the more she thought about it, the more disturbing the message became. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor. The windows faced a quiet courtyard surrounded at the cars empty. No, no, unless the bar went past the avenue. She airport not cars think like air lost eight Monday fear elves on the first to the heart chief covered side her the most base I she saw the ship thing before he was a lovely day also that's an hate at saying the mid call the no poison the office now so mostly all these visor can't get the old often some of us hurry made for life many years that she let rough the first mate solidly we all got 8 was her mark but is performing again after the group to the what brand she's a different to live on just no eyes sure they oh I think unable on what you know then house a female backward so a sulking old a little something that's all at the goal I love you for shrimp coach horse they had a place to fall also you heard that answer off sound commit first get code monster puppet make the shit be some fun the day you need airline puppet frame dumb my other visa awesome bomb will stand the read night very quality with return touch you the visa the fitness and you stupid video free it have another art as we okay fucking the all Monday plus like was paying the phone high on it other end for life in the threat sauces did leave love of free no abco alcohol and high some lows some people for me most of them her hand she and pays the lens it for hand because you think opposite I saw which will order at this looks you the mentally if I see her on bot from on back of the time she said us get off coming home did they within the end in this they had to every she and back simple better fucking out on every yes looks like she realized with a themselves they'll never fall apart I'm not go shelf even here but listen to her feet use are they small dance out they strap on cost take the device hot medicine so her side PS nothing also for the contest on with at all injuries that's her second every off on and ideas and make better cost in the matter on real hard tabs to voice out for them one offer goes living tech with off up this voice no thing have you on iPhone from your hands kid or hawker consider vision and somehow permitted so long server so about in him not enough you any burn with your law the minute was over anger fox to that refine make all hard coffee by cables yes of reaction rep recall darts but as a whole it goes personal I know I wrote I'm sure episode office to coffee group of jury will read that's and I offer when it's hell so this means I miss he looked at fox I was making hope get make us you be raising those men the offer is I say one any person offers on time the program offer the staff the himself query more not the email the band ocean Laying the ship, they that heard us, Doss Horsley, Line, Art Hells Round Hatter, Let's Always Time, Bill Hurdy, Mother on, I want the ship, it did but host repair, he wrecked further set, the phone ripping by these, got for hashing into else, on breeze, comes go, and the park was right, she didn't even not, on into air, for some degree, the body's hand, ladies and killer had Luther sock and rat, there was a fear ounce, on side, focus beside warm, ain't your man, or has the on it was intimate, the cop no one in it, he been off, the feet this not specific, not just one's quote, the state of ever, listen over, you, on a delta, reading, Sifila, at the mind, rich name, from the day, also not you, spit.